Are you ready to witness an emotional story where the courage and kindness of a young girl transformed an entire flight? In a situation filled with injustice and pressure, this little girl taught us all a valuable lesson about resilience, compassion, and the power of kindness. Join us in discovering the extraordinary journey of Amara, a young passenger with a big heart who changed not only a flight, but also how we perceive humanity and kindness. You definitely don't want to miss this story. The early sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating Amara Carter's tidy little room. Inside, model airplanes were carefully arranged, as if ready to take off at any moment. Amara, with her sleek black hair tied neatly, was busy checking her small backpack. She pulled out a white model airplane, a miniature replica of the one her father, Captain Jonathan Carter, often flew. "Are you ready, little pilot?" Her father's deep, warm voice called from the doorway. Amara turned around, her face beaming. "Yes, Dad. I've checked everything. The lucky airplane is here too." Captain Carter stepped into the room in his crisp pilot uniform, golden stripes on his shoulders, and a shiny badge on his chest. He knelt down to Amara's level, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This is your first solo flight. I want you to remember, you're not just a passenger, you're part of the team. Always hold your head high and keep kindness in your heart, no matter what happens." Amara nodded, her eyes glowing with pride. She took a deep breath, as if filling herself with the confidence her father had just passed on to her. The car carrying the father and daughter pulled into the bustling international airport. Inside, neon lights reflected off the polished tile floors. Captain Carter walked with purpose, one protective hand on Amara's shoulder. As they passed by, airport staff nodded respectfully, acknowledging him. Amara felt a ripple of pride spread through her, as if sharing in a small piece of her father's aura. At the security checkpoint, Captain Carter stopped and knelt down to look Amara in the eyes one last time before she began her solo journey. "Do you remember what I told you?" Amara nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, Dad. I'll always hold my head high and ask for help if I need it." Captain Carter smiled and gave her a tight hug before handing over her boarding pass. "See you on the other side, little pilot." Amara walked toward the boarding gate, her small hand clutching her backpack tightly. Pinned to her chest was a tiny metal pilot's wing, a gift from her father to encourage her dream of following in his footsteps. At the ticket counter, she had to stand on her tiptoes to hand over her boarding pass to the flight attendant, Rebecca Moore. Rebecca, with her blonde hair neatly tied up and a cold expression, barely glanced at Amara before taking the pass. "Unaccompanied minor?" she asked, her tone impatient and dismissive. "Yes, ma'am," Amara replied politely. "My dad is the pilot for this flight. He's made all the arrangements." Rebecca raised an eyebrow, skepticism flashing in her eyes. "Listen here, little girl. There are no special privileges here, even if your dad's a pilot. Everyone follows the same rules." Amara blushed slightly. She hadn't been looking for special treatment. She just wanted to share her small joy about her father. But Rebecca's curt tone left her silent. Quietly, Amara took back her boarding pass and stepped aside. The airplane cabin glowed brightly under its overhead lights. Some passengers had already settled into their seats, while others were busy placing their luggage into the overhead compartments. Amara made her way to the window seat her father had chosen for her, where she could watch the airplane's wing and the endless sky beyond. But before she could sit down, Rebecca appeared again, her expression filled with annoyance. "You can't sit here," Rebecca said, pointing toward the back of the plane. "Unaccompanied minors are required to sit in the seats near the restroom." Amara looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "But my dad reserved this seat for me. He wanted me to sit by the window." Rebecca cut her off sharply. "No exceptions. That's the rule." All eyes around them began to turn toward Amara. She bit her lip, lowered her head, and quietly gathered her belongings before moving to the back. The last row near the restroom wasn't much of a seat at all. Instead of a proper window, there was a small pane partially obstructed by a partition. The restroom door creaked open and shut constantly, accompanied by unpleasant odors. Amara sat down, hugging her backpack tightly, trying to keep her composure. She repeated her father's words in her head. "Hold your head high, no matter what happens." Next to her, an older passenger named Mr. Allen noticed the unusual quietness of the little girl. He leaned over with a warm smile. "You're a young traveler, aren't you?" Amara looked up, trying to manage a small smile. "Yes, sir. I'm visiting my aunt, and my dad is the pilot for this flight." Mr. Allen's eyes lit up. "Really? Well, you must be proud. Not everyone gets to fly with their family." Amara's smile grew a bit brighter. She nodded, feeling a small sense of relief knowing that at least someone was paying attention to her. However, from a distance, Rebecca continued to observe Amara with a disapproving look. She felt irritated seeing an unaccompanied minor receiving attention and sympathy. Deciding she wouldn't let things go easy for the girl, Rebecca resolved to make her presence felt. Amara sat quietly in the row near the restroom, clutching her backpack tightly as if it were the only lifeline in a vast, unfamiliar sea. She didn't want to cry, but the feeling of being relegated to this seat instead of the window her father had lovingly chosen for her left her uncomfortable. The constant creak of the restroom door opening and closing, paired with the sound of footsteps passing by, only made the air around her feel heavier. Rebecca walked down the aisle, pushing the drink cart. When she reached Amara's row, the friendly demeanor she had shown to other passengers vanished. Instead, her expression turned cold and her tone became detached. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked flatly, barely looking at Amara. Amara looked up, trying her best to remain polite. "Yes, ma'am. May I have an orange juice, please?" Rebecca smirked slightly and poured orange juice into a plastic cup. But as she set the cup down on Amara's tray, she deliberately placed it with a heavy hand, causing some of the juice to spill onto the corner of the tray. "You should be more careful," Rebecca remarked, as if the spill were Amara's fault. Amara's face turned red with embarrassment. She bowed her head and whispered, "I'm sorry," before quickly pulling a napkin from her backpack to clean up the mess. Nearby, Mr. Allen observed the entire interaction. His brow furrowed, but he remained silent, giving Rebecca a disapproving look as she moved on. A little while later, Amara took out a sketchbook and a pencil from her backpack, seeking some solace in her own little world. She began drawing the airplane wing, her favorite image. The graceful lines of her sketch began to take shape, and for a brief moment, Amara felt a sense of calm return. But that moment of peace didn't last long. Rebecca returned and noticed the sketchbook on Amara's tray. Her eyes narrowed sharply. "This isn't an art class," Rebecca said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "You shouldn't be scribbling and making a mess on the seat. Who's going to clean it up?" Amara froze, her small hands trembling as she hurriedly began gathering her sketchbook and pencil. "I didn't make a mess, ma'am," she said softly, her voice quivering. "Don't talk back," Rebecca interrupted, crossing her arms and glaring down at Amara. "I already have enough to deal with without you making things more difficult." Amara bowed her head and tucked her supplies back into her backpack without saying another word. Around her, murmurs began to spread among the passengers. Miss Diane, an elderly woman sitting a few rows away, shook her head in disapproval. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she said quietly to the person next to her. "The poor girl was just sitting there and drawing. Why make it so hard for her?" Not long after, another situation arose. Ms. Diane was struggling to fasten her seatbelt due to her arthritic hands. Amara, noticing her difficulty, quickly unbuckled her own seatbelt and leaned over to help. "Let me help you," Amara said softly, her small hands carefully adjusting the seatbelt for the elderly woman. Miss Diane smiled warmly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, dear. You're so kind," she said. But the small act of kindness didn't escape Rebecca's notice. She stormed over, her voice sharp and cold. "What do you think you're doing? Who gave you permission to leave your seat?" Amara flinched, looking up to meet Rebecca's stern gaze. I just wanted to help her fasten her seatbelt, ma'am," she stammered. "That's not your responsibility," Rebecca snapped, her tone cutting. "Rules are rules. Get back to your seat and stop causing trouble." Passengers nearby began to turn their heads toward the commotion. A few frowned, clearly disapproving of Rebecca's harsh tone. "She was just helping her," Mr. Allen said loudly, unable to hide his frustration. "Since when is kindness against the rules?" Rebecca turned to face him, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm just doing my job, sir." "Then perhaps you should reconsider how you're doing it," he replied, his voice full of challenge. Amara quietly returned to her seat, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She bowed her head, but in her heart, she repeated her father's words. Hold your head high, Amara. Hold your head high. Shortly after, Rebecca made her way to the cockpit where her uncle, Benjamin Moore, was co-piloting alongside Captain Carter. Uncle Ben, she said, her voice full of self-importance, there's an unaccompanied minor on this flight, and she's causing quite a bit of trouble. I think we need to take stricter action to maintain order. Benjamin looked up, his sharp eyes mirroring Rebecca's demeanor. Who is this child? She's Captain Carter's daughter, Rebecca replied with a shrug. But rules are rules, right? Benjamin let out a sly laugh, his expression smug. We don't make exceptions for anyone, even if she's the captain's daughter. If necessary, do whatever needs to be done. Rebecca nodded, her resolve hardening as she returned to the cabin, determined to teach Amara a lesson she deemed necessary. Rebecca returned to the passenger cabin with a determined expression. Her mind was consumed with the thought that Amara needed to be put in her place. She couldn't tolerate the trouble caused by this child, even if she was Captain Carter's daughter. Amara sat quietly in the last row, her small hands clutching her backpack as if it were her only refuge. The murmurs from the passengers around her continued, most of them disapproving of Rebecca's actions, but Amara didn't dare look up. Rebecca approached Amara, deliberately standing in front of her seat to create an air of intimidation. You seem to be attracting quite a bit of attention, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Do you have anything to explain? Amara looked up, her eyes wide with confusion. I don't understand, ma'am. Rebecca tapped lightly on the tray in front of Amara. A passenger just reported a missing handbag. Have you seen it, or perhaps you accidentally took it? The baseless accusation silenced the entire cabin for a moment. Amara's eyes widened in disbelief. I didn't take anything, ma'am. I've just been sitting here. Rebecca smirked, her gaze icy. Do you know that stealing on an airplane is a criminal offense? If you don't want any trouble, you'd better come clean now. That's a completely baseless accusation, a voice rang out from the front. Mr. Allen stood up, his tone filled with indignation. I've been sitting nearby and watching this girl the entire flight. She hasn't done anything wrong. Rebecca turned to him, attempting to maintain her composure. Sir, I'm simply following procedures to ensure the safety of all passengers. Procedures? Mr. Allen shot back, his voice rising. Or are you just finding excuses to bully and humiliate a child? Rebecca's lips tightened as she tried to contain her reaction. But the murmur of disapproval from the other passengers was growing louder. At that moment, Ms. Diane stood up, despite her slightly trembling legs. This little girl helped me fasten my seatbelt when no one else cared to. Someone so kind couldn't possibly be a thief. Rebecca, you need to reconsider your behavior. Ms. Diane's words were met with nods of agreement from several passengers. The murmurs of discontent grew louder, creating a tense atmosphere. A young passenger sitting a few rows away quietly took out his phone and began recording the scene. He recognized this as an act of injustice that needed to be documented. Just as the cabin began descending into chaos, Emily Monroe, Rebecca's colleague, appeared. With a calm but authoritative demeanor, she stepped between Rebecca and Amara. Rebecca, what's going on here? Emily asked, her voice gentle but unmistakably firm. This girl might be connected to a missing item reported by a passenger, Rebecca replied, trying to sound confident. Emily turned to Amara, kneeling to meet her eye level. Amara, do you know anything about what happened? Amara shook her head, her voice trembling. I don't know anything, ma'am. I've just been sitting here since we boarded. Emily offered a reassuring smile, placing a comforting hand on Amara's shoulder. It's okay, I believe you. Then she stood, facing Rebecca directly. I think we need to have a private conversation. Rebecca frowned, but the unwavering resolve in Emily's eyes and the watchful gaze of the surrounding passengers left her no choice but to agree. In the galley at the back of the plane, Emily faced Rebecca with an expression more serious than before. Rebecca, what is going on? Emily asked bluntly. You're targeting a child. Do you really think this is how we should be conducting ourselves? Rebecca folded her arms defensively. I'm just following the rules. A passenger reported a missing item, and I need to explore all possibilities. But you have no evidence to accuse her, Emily retorted, her tone icy. Do you even know who that little girl is? Her father is Captain Carter, the pilot of this flight. Rebecca froze momentarily, but then shrugged, attempting to mask her surprise. It doesn't matter who she is. All passengers must follow the same rules. Emily shook her head, disappointment evident in her eyes. You didn't just harm a little girl. You damaged the airline's reputation. If you continue this, it won't just be a minor issue. This could become a formal complaint. Rebecca remained silent. Emily's words felt like a harsh wake-up call, yet deep down, Rebecca still struggled to admit her fault. At the same time, a passenger sent the recorded video to the captain. Sitting in the cockpit, Captain Carter received the footage through the internal network. As he watched, his expression hardened, realizing the injustice his daughter was enduring. Emily, bring Rebecca and Benjamin to the cockpit, he said through the intercom. We need to address this immediately. Rebecca entered the cockpit alongside her uncle, Benjamin Moore, her face betraying her unease despite her attempts to appear composed. She tried to maintain her calm demeanor, but Captain Carter's steely gaze made her acutely aware of the shifting dynamics. Benjamin, while outwardly confident, frowned slightly, sensing the palpable tension in the confined space of the cockpit. Captain Carter rose from his seat, his eyes fixed on Rebecca. Rebecca, can you explain to me what's going on in the passenger cabin? He asked slowly, each word carrying an unmistakable tone of authority and disapproval. Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. Captain, I was simply following protocol. A passenger reported a missing item, and I needed to consider all possibilities, including the chance that the girl might have accidentally taken it. Do you have any evidence to support your accusation? Captain Carter asked, his tone growing colder. I was just doing my job, Rebecca replied, avoiding his piercing gaze. Doing your job doesn't mean abusing your authority, Captain Carter retorted, his eyes narrowing. Especially when your actions not only hurt a child, but also created unrest among the passengers. I've received video footage from a passenger ducking the entire incident, and I am deeply disappointed in how you handled the situation. Benjamin interjected, his tone defensive. Jonathan, I think you're overreacting. Rebecca was simply trying to ensure the safety of the flight. This isn't that big of a deal. Captain Carter turned his sharp gaze to Benjamin, his demeanor unyielding. Benjamin, this isn't just about a child being treated unfairly. This is about the reputation of the airline we represent. Behavior like this cannot and will not be tolerated, no matter who's involved. Benjamin started to argue, but quickly realized that Captain Carter's firm stance left no room for further excuses. He let out a disgruntled sigh and remained silent, allowing Carter to continue. Captain Carter turned back to Rebecca. You will apologize to Amara in front of all the passengers. Furthermore, I will report this incident to upper management. I hope this serves as a lesson you will never forget. Rebecca opened her mouth as though she wanted to protest, but the decisive look in Captain Carter's eyes silenced her. She nodded reluctantly. Yes, Captain, she said quietly. Rebecca returned to the passenger cabin, where the atmosphere had grown more tense than ever. Passengers were still murmuring, their dissatisfied gazes directed squarely at her. Amara sat quietly in the last row, her eyes red and teary, though she maintained an impressive calmness for someone her age. Rebecca stopped in front of Amara's seat, took a deep breath, and bent down. Amara, I'm sorry. I was wrong to accuse you without any evidence. You're a good passenger, and I should not have made you feel uncomfortable. Amara looked up, her eyes reflecting surprise. Thank you, she said softly, her voice sincere. Rebecca's apology wasn't just for Amara, it was spoken loudly enough for all the passengers to hear. I also apologize to all the passengers for disrupting this flight. I promise to reflect on this incident and ensure it doesn't happen again. Shortly after, Mr. Allen stood up and addressed Amara. Young lady, you did wonderfully. You stayed calm, and that shows you have a strong heart. Anyone could learn something from you. Other passengers began to clap, creating a wave of applause to encourage the young girl. Amara bowed her head slightly, her eyes lighting up with happiness at the overwhelming support. Captain Carter emerged from the cockpit and walked toward Amara. Sitting beside his daughter, he gently took her hand. Sweetheart, I'm so proud of you. You've shown not just how to be a good passenger, but also how to be a role model of patience and composure. You've proven that you can handle any challenge. Amara smiled, her eyes sparkling with pride. I just did what you taught me, Dad. I always remember to hold my head high no matter what happens. Captain Carter pulled her into a tight hug. Not only did you hold your head high, but you also accomplished much more than that. Rebecca's apology and the passengers' applause had restored a sense of calm to the cabin. Amara's quiet strength and kindness left a lasting impression on everyone, reminding them of the power of grace under pressure. The journey continued, but for many it was more than just a flight. It was a lesson in humanity. The baseless accusations silenced the entire cabin for a moment. Amara's eyes widened in disbelief. I didn't do anything, ma'am. I've just been sitting here. Rebecca smirked, her icy gaze fixed on Amara. Do you know that stealing on an airplane is a criminal offense? If you don't want trouble, it's best to come clean now. That is an unfounded accusation, a voice rang out from the front. Mr. Allen stood up, his voice filled with indignation. I've been sitting near this girl since the start of the flight. She hasn't done anything wrong. Rebecca turned to him, attempting to maintain her composure. Sir, I'm simply following protocol to ensure the safety of all passengers. Protocol? Or are you just finding excuses to bully and humiliate a child? Mr. Allen shot back, refusing to back down. At that moment, Ms. Diane also stood up, despite her slightly trembling legs. This little girl helped me fasten my seatbelt when no one else cared to. Someone so kind couldn't possibly be a thief. And you, Rebecca, should reflect on your behavior. Ms. Diane's words garnered agreement from several passengers. The murmurs of dissatisfaction grew louder, creating an increasingly tense atmosphere. A young passenger sitting a few rows away quietly took out his phone and began recording. He recognized this as an unjust situation that needed to be documented. As the atmosphere in the cabin teetered on the edge of chaos, Emily Monroe, Rebecca's colleague, appeared. With a calm yet authoritative demeanor, she stepped between Rebecca and Amara. Rebecca, what's going on here? Emily asked, her voice gentle but firm. This girl might be connected to a missing item reported by a passenger, Rebecca replied, trying to sound confident. Emily turned to Amara, crouching down to meet her at eye level. Amara, do you know anything about what happened? She asked gently. Amara shook her head, her voice trembling. I don't know anything, ma'am. I've just been sitting here since we boarded. Emily smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on Amara's shoulder. It's okay. I believe you. She then stood up, turning to face Rebecca. I think we need to have a private conversation. Rebecca frowned, but under Emily's steady gaze and the attention of the passengers around her, reluctantly agreed. In the galley at the back of the plane, Emily faced Rebecca with an unusually stern expression. Rebecca, what is going on? Emily asked bluntly. You're targeting a child. Do you really think this is the right way to handle things? Rebecca crossed her arms, her tone defensive. I'm just following protocol. A passenger reported a missing item, and I have to explore every possibility. But you have no evidence to accuse her, Emily responded coldly. Do you even know who that little girl is? Her father is Captain Carter, the pilot of this flight. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, her surprise evident, but she quickly shrugged it off. It doesn't matter who she is. Rules are rules. Emily shook her head, her disappointment clear. You didn't just hurt the little girl, you've also damaged the airline's reputation. If you continue, this won't just be a minor issue, it could escalate into a formal complaint. Rebecca remained silent. Emily's words felt like a sharp wake-up call, though deep down, Rebecca was still reluctant to admit her mistake. At the same time, a passenger sent the recorded video to the captain. In the cockpit, Captain Carter received the footage through the internal network. Watching the video, his expression hardened as he realized the injustice his daughter was enduring. Emily, bring Rebecca and Benjamin to the cockpit, he said over the intercom. We need to address this immediately. Rebecca and Benjamin stepped into the cockpit, and the tension in the room became palpable immediately. Captain Carter stood up from his seat, his sharp gaze cutting through every expression on their faces. He said nothing for a few seconds, allowing the heavy silence to settle over them, making Rebecca increasingly uneasy. Benjamin maintained a smug exterior, but inwardly he realized the situation was not in their favor. Rebecca, Captain Carter finally spoke, his voice deep and commanding. Can you explain to me what's happening in the passenger cabin? Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to appear composed. Captain, I was simply following security protocol. A passenger reported a missing item, and I needed to investigate all possibilities. I had no intention of harming anyone. Is that so? Captain Carter's voice dropped, his tone dangerously calm. Do you have any evidence to support your accusation? Rebecca lowered her head, silent. There was nothing she could say to justify her actions. The footage from the passenger's video made it clear there was no valid reason for her treatment of Amara. Benjamin intervened, attempting to defend his niece. Jonathan, I think you're blowing this out of proportion. Rebecca was just trying to ensure the safety of the flight. This isn't such a big deal. Captain Carter turned his unwavering gaze to Benjamin, his tone unrelenting. Benjamin, the issue here is not the missing handbag or any other item. The issue is your niece abusing her authority to unfairly target a child, and I emphasize that child is my daughter, but even if she weren't, such behavior is utterly unacceptable. Benjamin froze, taken aback by the force of Carter's words. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when Carter's piercing stare silenced him. Rebecca, Captain Carter continued, you have hurt a passenger and significantly damaged the airline's reputation. I will be reporting this incident to upper management. For now, you need to apologize to Amara in front of all the passengers. Rebecca opened her mouth as though to protest, but quickly closed it again. She understood there was no other option. Yes, Captain, she said quietly, her voice laced with embarrassment. Back in the passenger cabin, Rebecca walked slowly, her steps weighed down by the judgmental gazes following her every move. Amara remained seated in the last row, her large, bright eyes fixed on Rebecca without a hint of hesitation. Rebecca stopped in front of Amara, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Amara, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry. I behaved wrongly. I shouldn't have accused you without any evidence. I hope you can forgive me. Amara looked at Rebecca for a few moments before offering a gentle smile. I forgive you. Everyone makes mistakes. Amara's words brought a brief silence to the cabin, followed by a round of applause that spread throughout the plane. Mr. Allen and Miss Diane led the clapping, both smiling approvingly. A few passengers even spoke out encouragingly. It's important to learn from mistakes. You did the right thing by apologizing. Rebecca bowed her head, feeling as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She knew she still had much to work on, but this felt like the start of something new. Captain Carter emerged from the cockpit and made his way to Amara. Kneeling down, he opened his arms wide and embraced her tightly. Sweetheart, you did an amazing job, he said, his voice full of emotion. You taught a lesson that not everyone could teach. I'm so proud of you. Amara smiled and hugged her father tightly. I just did what you always taught me, Dad. I always remember to stay calm and hold my head high, no matter what happens. Captain Carter nodded, his eyes filled with pride. You didn't just stay calm. You showed everyone the power of kindness. That's what matters most. Mr. Allen stepped forward and approached the father and daughter. Captain Carter, you have an incredible daughter. She's not only strong, but also an inspiration to all of us on this flight. Thank you. Captain Carter replied, shaking Mr. Allen's hand. I'm incredibly proud of her, and I'm grateful to you and all the other passengers for supporting her through this. Amara looked around and saw smiles and encouraging gazes directed her way. Her heart swelled with warmth. That day, she didn't just learn how to face challenges, she also discovered the strength of kindness and the power of unity. As all the passengers disembarked, Rebecca stood quietly at the back of the cabin, watching Amara and her father leave. For the first time in years, she felt truly small. What had happened today was not just a lesson in responsibility, but also a poignant reminder of the kindness she had long forgotten. Silently, she promised herself that she needed to change, to become a better person, not only in her work, but in her life. Amara and Captain Carter stepped out of the airport, the gentle afternoon sunlight casting a warm glow over them. In Amara's hands was the model airplane she always carried, a symbol of the big dreams she was determined to pursue. Today was not just a flight, it was a journey that changed lives, not only Amara's, but also those who had shared the experience with her. Amara's story reminds us all that even the smallest acts of kindness can create monumental change. Treat everyone with respect and stand up against injustice, because it is through compassion and unity that we can make the world a better place. Are you ready to spread kindness today?